The metal detector's signal pierced through the quiet morning air of the Polish forest, its insistent beeping growing stronger with each sweep across the leaf-covered ground. Thomas Kowalski had been searching these woods for nearly 3 hours, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp October air, when the device suddenly screamed with an intensity he had never heard before. His younger brother Martin, walking 20 meters behind, looked up from his own detector at the urgency in the sound. They had explored countless forests across Eastern Europe over the past 5 years, uncovering old coins, buttons, and various remnants of lives long past, but this signal was different. This was the kind of reading that made a detectorist's heart race, the kind that suggested something substantial lay beneath decades of accumulated soil and forgotten time. Thomas dropped to his knees and began carefully brushing away the thick layer of pine needles and decomposing leaves. Martin jogged over, his equipment jangling against his backpack, and knelt beside his brother without a word. The excitement between them was palpable, communicating itself through quick glances and synchronized movements born from years of shared expeditions. As Thomas cleared more debris, his gloved fingers struck something solid and metallic. The rust was immediate and obvious, a deep orange-brown that spoke of long exposure to the elements, but the shape beneath began to reveal itself as something far more significant than another discarded shell casing or abandoned tool. And if you're already feeling the excitement of this discovery, imagine being part of this journey every single week. Hit that subscribe button right now and join our community of history enthusiasts who love uncovering the mysteries of the past. And if you really want to support this channel and get exclusive behind-the-scenes content, click on Super Thanks below this video. Your support helps us bring these incredible stories to life. Oh, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing our global community come together over these amazing historical discoveries. The brothers worked methodically, their practiced hands removing soil with small trowels and brushes, careful not to damage whatever lay hidden. As more of the object emerged, its circular shape became unmistakable. The curvature suggested something large, something industrial, something military. Thomas felt along the edges, tracing what appeared to be a rim, while Martin cleared the center section. When enough had been exposed, they both sat back on their heels, staring at what they had uncovered. It was a hatch, approximately 80 centimeters in diameter, with visible bolt holes around its perimeter and the unmistakable remnants of German military markings barely visible through the corrosion. The forest around them seemed to grow quieter, as if nature itself was holding its breath. They were not archaeologists, but they had found enough artifacts over the years to understand the proper protocols. This was not something they could simply extract and carry home. This was something that belonged to history, something that required experts, documentation, and careful handling. But before they made any calls, before they contacted the authorities or the local historical society, they needed to understand exactly what they had found. Martin pulled out his phone and began photographing the hatch from multiple angles, while Thomas carefully noted their exact GPS coordinates and sketched the surrounding area in his worn field notebook. The markings on the hatch, though heavily oxidized, suggested it had belonged to a panzer tank, likely from the middle years of the war based on the style of the metalwork. But what was a tank hatch doing here, alone in the middle of a forest that showed no signs of having been a battlefield? There were no crater depressions, no evidence of trenches, no indication that this location had seen combat. The brothers had studied enough military history to know that tanks did not simply shed components like trees dropping leaves. If a hatch was here, separated from its vehicle, something significant had happened. Thomas stood and began walking in widening circles around the discovery point, his detector sweeping methodically. Within minutes, he located another strong signal approximately 15 meters to the northeast. Martin joined him, and together they began the careful excavation process once more. This time, the metal revealed itself more quickly, another piece of armor plating, twisted and torn in a way that suggested violent force. The edge was sheared, the metal bent backward as if something had ripped through it from the inside out or crushed it from above. They marked the location and continued their search pattern. Over the next 2 hours, they found 6 more significant pieces of wreckage, each one scattered across an area roughly 40 meters in diameter. The distribution pattern was not random. It suggested an explosion or catastrophic mechanical failure, the kind that would have torn a vehicle apart and scattered its components across the forest floor. But there was something unusual about the find. The pieces were deep, buried under at least 50 centimeters of soil and organic matter, suggesting they had been here for many decades, possibly since the war itself. Yet there was no local record, no historical documentation they could recall that mentioned a tank being destroyed or abandoned in this specific location. The brothers decided to expand their search before contacting anyone. They worked until the autumn sun began its early descent toward the horizon, methodically covering the entire area. They discovered smaller items too: shell casings, pieces of track links, fragments of what appeared to be personal equipment. Each item was photographed, marked with a small flag, and recorded in Thomas's notebook. The most haunting discovery came late in the afternoon when Martin's detector signaled over a small depression near the base of an old oak tree. Carefully clearing the soil, he uncovered a German military identification disc, the metal deeply tarnished but the stamp numbers still partially legible. The ID disc changed everything. This was no longer just about finding pieces of a destroyed vehicle. This was about a person, a soldier who had been here, who had perhaps died here, whose fate had been unknown for 7 decades. The brothers handled the disc with reverent care, placing it in a protective bag and photographing it extensively. The numbers and letters would need to be properly examined by experts who could cross-reference them with military records, but even in its corroded state, it represented a direct connection to someone's life, someone's story. As darkness began to settle over the forest, Thomas and Martin packed their equipment and took a final series of photographs showing the entire site from multiple vantage points. They would return in the morning with better lighting and more supplies, but for now, they needed to contact the appropriate authorities. The walk back to their vehicle was conducted in contemplative silence, both brothers processing the magnitude of what they had discovered. This was not treasure in the traditional sense, not something they could sell or keep. This was history demanding to be heard, a voice from the past insisting on recognition. That evening, from their hotel room in the nearby town of Krosno, they began making calls. The local museum's curator, Dr. Helena Mazur, listened intently to their description and requested that they send the photographs immediately. Within 20 minutes of receiving the images, she called back, her voice trembling with barely contained excitement. Based on the style of the hatch and the identification disc markings, she believed they had found remnants of a Panzer IV tank, likely from the Middle or Late War period. But more significantly, the location matched descriptions from several unverified reports in the museum's archives that had been filed away decades ago as unsubstantiated folklore. Dr. Mazur explained that there had been persistent local stories about a German tank that had vanished in late 1944 during the chaotic retreat from the advancing Soviet forces. The stories varied in details, some claiming the tank had been ambushed by partisans, others suggesting it had been destroyed by Soviet aircraft, and still others maintaining it had simply broken down and been abandoned by its crew. But none of the stories had ever been confirmed because no physical evidence had ever been located. The area had been searched multiple times over the years by various groups, but the dense forest and the passage of time had kept the site hidden. Until now. The curator arranged for a full archaeological team to visit the site within 3 days. In the meantime, she requested that the brothers keep the location confidential to prevent unauthorized digging and potential looting. She also put them in contact with military historians and researchers who specialized in tracking down information about missing personnel and units from the war. The identification disc numbers were sent to archives in Germany, Poland, and Russia, beginning a process that would eventually connect the scattered metal in the forest to real names, real faces, and real families who had waited generations for answers. When the archaeological team arrived at the forest site 3 days later, they brought ground-penetrating radar equipment, professional excavation tools, and a level of methodical precision that made the brothers' initial discovery look like amateur hour. Dr. Mazur led the team, accompanied by 2 military historians, a forensic anthropologist, and several graduate students who would be documenting every aspect of the excavation. The weather had turned colder, and a light rain had fallen the previous night, making the ground softer but also more challenging to work with. The radar equipment immediately revealed what the metal detectors had only hinted at. Beneath the surface, approximately 2 meters down at the deepest point, lay the bulk of the tank's remains. The vehicle had not simply been destroyed on the surface and gradually buried by natural processes. Instead, it appeared to have been deliberately concealed, covered with soil and vegetation in what must have been a massive undertaking. The radar images showed the distinct outline of a turret, a portion of the hull, and what appeared to be the chassis, all relatively intact despite the scattered debris the brothers had found on the surface. The discovery raised immediate questions. Who had buried the tank? Why had it been concealed rather than simply left where it fell? And most intriguingly, if it had been deliberately hidden, what else might be buried with it? The team established a grid system over the site, divided the area into manageable sections, and began the painstaking process of excavation. Every shovelful of dirt was sifted, every item catalogued, and every discovery photographed from multiple angles before being carefully removed. As the first day of official excavation progressed, the team uncovered more personal items: a water canteen with a dented side, the remains of what appeared to be a leather map case, several buttons from military uniforms, and fragments of what might have been a diary or notebook, though the paper had long since decomposed into an unreadable mass. Each item was treated as a potential clue, a piece of a puzzle that, when assembled, might reveal what had happened in this forest so many years ago. The turret emerged on the second day, its metal scarred and pitted but largely intact. The main gun was missing, apparently sheared off at some point, but the hatch mechanisms were still functional, frozen in the closed position by decades of rust and corrosion. The team used hydraulic jacks and careful application of penetrating oil to slowly work the turret hatch open, a process that took nearly 6 hours and required constant monitoring to ensure nothing was damaged. When the hatch finally gave way with a groan of protesting metal, Dr. Mazer was the first to shine a flashlight into the dark interior. The turret compartment was partially filled with decades of accumulated groundwater, soil that had filtered through microscopic gaps in the seals, and the detritus of time. But it was not empty. Submerged in the murky water were more personal effects, equipment, and most significantly, human remains. The forensic anthropologist took over at this point, carefully documenting the position and condition of the bones before beginning the delicate process of recovery. Based on the initial examination, the remains belonged to at least 2 individuals, both of whom had been inside the turret when whatever happened to the tank occurred. The discovery transformed the excavation from an interesting historical find into something far more solemn. This was now a recovery operation, a burial site that demanded respect and care. The team worked in subdued silence, each person acutely aware that they were handling the physical remains of young men who had died far from home in a war that had claimed millions. The bones were carefully extracted, cleaned, and placed in protective containers, with samples taken for DNA analysis that might eventually help identify them and perhaps bring closure to families who had spent 70 years wondering what had happened to their sons, brothers, or fathers. As the hull was gradually uncovered over the following days, the reason for the tank's destruction became clearer. The armor on the right side showed evidence of a catastrophic penetration, the kind of damage consistent with a direct hit from a Soviet anti-tank round or possibly a mine strike. The metal was punched inward, creating a hole approximately 30 centimeters in diameter, with the edges blown back into the crew compartment. Such a hit would have been instantly fatal to anyone in the immediate vicinity, and the resulting fire or ammunition explosion would have made the vehicle uninhabitable for any survivors. But the mystery of why the tank had been buried remained. The team found the answer when they uncovered the area immediately around the hull. Mixed with the soil were tools, shovels, and the remains of wooden timbers that appeared to have been used as supports during the burial process. More tellingly, they found spent shell casings from Soviet rifles scattered around the perimeter of the excavation, along with fragments of Soviet military equipment. The picture that emerged was both tragic and strangely compassionate. The tank had been knocked out during combat, its crew killed instantly or shortly after the strike. Soviet forces had advanced through the area, encountered the destroyed vehicle, and apparently made the decision to bury it rather than simply leaving it as they pushed forward. This was unusual behavior for an advancing army, which typically had neither the time nor the inclination to conduct such burials for enemy equipment. But the evidence was undeniable. Soviet soldiers had spent hours, perhaps a full day, excavating a large pit, using draft horses or a recovery vehicle to drag the tank into the depression, and then covering it with soil and forest debris. One of the military historians on the team offered a possible explanation. By late 1944, when this incident likely occurred based on the tank model and the historical context, the war's outcome was becoming increasingly clear. Soviet forces were pushing deep into German-held territory, and many soldiers on both sides were exhausted by years of constant combat. It was not unprecedented for victorious forces to show respect for fallen enemies, particularly if the local situation allowed for such gestures. Perhaps a Soviet commander had ordered the burial as an act of basic human decency, recognizing that these dead German soldiers were no longer enemies but simply casualties of a terrible war. The excavation of the driver's compartment yielded more artifacts and, heartbreakingly, more remains. The driver had died at his post, still seated in position, his hands apparently reaching for the escape hatch that he never managed to open. Beside him, in what would have been the radio operator's position, was another set of remains, this one showing evidence of severe trauma consistent with being in the direct path of the penetrating round. Personal effects recovered from these forward positions included 2 more identification discs, a pocket watch stopped permanently at 347, and a small photograph protected by a metal cigarette case. The photograph, once carefully cleaned and treated by conservation specialists, revealed a young woman holding a small child. On the back, written in fading ink, was a date from 1943 and a name, Margarethi. This single image, preserved by chance through 7 decades underground, humanized the discovery in a way that metal and bones could not. These were not just soldiers, not just casualties of war, but real people with families, loved ones, and lives that had been cut short in a Polish forest far from home. As the excavation entered its second week, the team had recovered the remains of 4 crew members and had documented the tank's destruction in meticulous detail. The identification discs had been sent for analysis, and researchers in Germany had begun cross-referencing the numbers with military records. The process was complicated by the fact that many Wehrmacht records had been destroyed during the war or lost in its chaotic aftermath, but military historians were skilled at piecing together information from multiple sources. Unit rosters, casualty reports, pension files, and personal correspondence held in various archives. 3 weeks after the brothers' initial discovery, the first identifications were confirmed. The disc Thomas and Martin had found near the oak tree belonged to Oberschutz Karl Brenner, age 21 at the time of his death, from a small village near Munich. Further research revealed that he had been reported missing in action in October 1944, part of a tank unit that had become separated from its main formation during the Soviet autumn offensive. His parents had died in the 1950s without ever knowing what happened to their son, but records indicated he had a younger sister who had survived the war. Through genealogical research and some fortunate connections with local historical societies in Bavaria, the team located Brenner's niece, a woman named Anna Hartmann, who was now 78 years old and living in a retirement home near Salzburg. When contacted by the German Military Liaison Office, she initially did not believe the news. Her uncle Karl had been a family legend, the handsome older cousin who had been conscripted and vanished into the vast Eastern Front, never to return. She had been only 8 years old when the war ended, but she remembered her grandmother weeping when each year passed without news. The other crew members were identified over the following months through similar painstaking research. Unteroffizier Friedrich Weber, the tank commander, from Cologne. Schütze Hans Dietrich, the driver, from a farming village in Saxony. Gefreiter Otto Mahler, the radio operator, from Hamburg. Each name came with a story, a family tree, and in most cases, living descendants who had never known the fate of their relatives. The German War Graves Commission coordinated with Polish authorities to arrange for the proper burial of the remains, with full military honors, in a German military cemetery near Krakow. But there was one more mystery to solve. The team had uncovered evidence of 5 identification discs, but had only recovered 4 sets of remains. The 5th disc belonged to Gefreiter Paul Schneider, listed as the tank's loader. His remains were not in the vehicle. The team expanded their search of the surrounding area, using cadaver dogs and more intensive ground-penetrating radar surveys. 3 days before the planned reburial ceremony, they found him. Schneider's remains were located 42 meters from the destroyed tank, at the base of a ravine that had likely been much shallower in 1944 before decades of erosion and forest growth had deepened it. The position and condition of the bones suggested a very different story from his crewmates. While they had died in or immediately near the tank, Schneider had apparently survived the initial hit and had attempted to escape. The trajectory from the tank to where he was found indicated he had been running, possibly trying to reach cover or perhaps simply fleeing in panic from the burning vehicle. The forensic examination revealed that Schneider had suffered significant injuries, including a fractured femur and multiple broken ribs, likely sustained either from the initial impact or while evacuating the tank. But what ultimately killed him was more difficult to determine. There was evidence of trauma to his skull, but whether this was from falling into the ravine, being shot, or some other cause could not be definitively established. What was clear was that he had not died instantly with his crew, but had survived long enough to travel some distance from the vehicle before succumbing to his injuries. This discovery added another layer to the story that the excavation team had pieced together. The tank had been hit during combat, killing or mortally wounding most of the crew immediately. Schneider, perhaps protected by his position or simply fortunate in that terrible moment, had survived the initial strike long enough to escape the vehicle. Injured and alone, he had tried to find safety but had collapsed in the ravine where he died, his body concealed by the landscape and eventually covered by natural processes rather than deliberate burial. The additional remains were included in the reburial plans, and the German War Graves Commission worked with genealogical researchers to trace Schneider's family. The search led to an unexpected discovery. Schneider's widow had survived the war and had eventually remarried in the early 1950s, but she had kept her first husband's memory alive. She had died in 2003, but before her death, she had donated her papers to a local historical society in Berlin, including dozens of letters Paul had sent her from the front, photographs from their brief courtship and marriage, and a diary she had kept documenting her life as a war widow. The historical society was contacted, and the materials were made available to the research team. Reading through Schneider's letters provided a haunting context to the cold facts of the excavation. He had written about his crew, describing them as decent men who looked out for each other. He mentioned Friedrich Weber's terrible jokes, Karl Brenner's homesickness, Otto Mahler's obsession with fixing radios that did not need fixing. He wrote about his fear of the Soviet advance, his hope that the war would end before his unit saw serious combat, and his desperate longing to return to Berlin and the wife he had married just 3 months before being sent to the Eastern Front. His final letter, dated October 7, 1944, reached his wife 3 weeks after it was written. In it, he described the autumn weather, the beautiful colors of the Polish forests, and his hope that he would be home for Christmas. He never mentioned combat, death, or fear, adhering to military censorship rules and perhaps to his own need to maintain hope. That letter, yellowed and fragile, was now displayed in the museum where Dr. Maser worked, part of an exhibition documenting the discovery and the stories of the 5 young men who had died in a forest that most of them had probably never heard of before the war sent them there. The reburial ceremony took place on a gray November morning, exactly 71 years after the estimated date of the tank's destruction. Representatives from the German and Polish governments attended, along with military honor guards from both nations. More importantly, family members came. Anna Hartmann made the journey from Austria, leaning heavily on her granddaughter's arm but determined to be present for the uncle she had never really known. Descendants of Friedrich Weber, Otto Mahler, and Hans Dietrich attended as well, some meeting each other for the first time, connected by the shared tragedy that had claimed their relatives. Paul Schneider's family was represented by his granddaughter, a woman he had never met, born months after his death. She stood quietly during the ceremony, holding a photograph of the grandmother she had known and the grandfather who had been only a ghost, a name on a memorial wall, a collection of letters in an archive. The discovery had given her something precious and painful: knowledge. She now knew where he had died, understood that he had tried to survive, and could finally put to rest the vague hope that somehow, impossibly, there had been a mistake and he was still out there somewhere. Thomas and Martin Kowalski attended the ceremony as well, standing at the back of the gathering, uncomfortable with attention but deeply moved by the outcome of their discovery. They had found countless artifacts over the years, but nothing had ever led to something like this. Their hobby, their weekend adventures with metal detectors, had returned 5 men to their families, had answered questions that had persisted for 70 years, and had provided closure to people who had been children when their relatives vanished. After the ceremony, Dr. Mazur approached the brothers with a proposal. The museum wanted to create a permanent exhibition about the discovery, not just as a military history display, but as a meditation on the human cost of war, the importance of remembering, and the unexpected ways history reveals itself. She wanted the brothers to help design the exhibit, to explain how careful observation and persistence had led to the discovery, and to encourage others to report significant finds rather than keeping them private or selling them. The exhibition opened 6 months later and included the recovered tank hatch that had started everything, personal effects from the crew, photographs of the excavation process, and the letters and diary that had provided context to the cold metal and bones. But the centerpiece was a recreation of that October morning in the forest, showing Thomas kneeling in the leaves, his metal detector beside him, the first glimpse of rust-orange metal emerging from the soil. It was titled simply, "Found." The discovery had broader implications beyond the 5 identified crew members. Military historians used the information to revise their understanding of the October 1944 fighting in that region of Poland. The tank unit that Weber's crew had belonged to was previously thought to have been destroyed much further east, but the evidence from the forest suggested the unit's retreat had been more disorganized and fragmented than records indicated. This seemingly small correction helped clarify the movements of several other units during that chaotic period, filling gaps in the historical record. Perhaps more significantly, the story of how Soviet soldiers had buried the tank sparked renewed interest in lesser-known acts of humanity during the war. Researchers began investigating similar incidents, finding documentation of other cases where advancing Soviet forces had taken time to bury enemy dead or mark grave sites rather than simply pushing forward. These acts did not erase the brutality of the war, the atrocities committed by all sides, or the immense suffering inflicted and endured. But they served as reminders that even in the midst of industrial-scale killing, individual humans sometimes chose compassion over expedience. The brothers continued their metal detecting, but the experience had changed their approach. They became more methodical in their documentation, more careful about reporting significant finds, and more conscious of the stories behind the objects they discovered. Thomas began volunteering with the museum, helping to train others in proper site documentation and artifact preservation. Martin started working with local schools, using their discovery to teach students about the war, about history, and about the importance of remembering those who came before. 3 years after the initial discovery, they were invited to speak at a conference of metal detecting enthusiasts in England. They presented not just on their techniques but on the responsibility that comes with uncovering the past. They showed photographs of Anna Hartmann weeping at her uncle's reburial, of Paul Schneider's granddaughter carefully touching his identification disc in the museum display, of the restored tank hatch with its barely visible German markings. They emphasized that what they found was not treasure but memory, not valuable metal but human stories demanding to be heard. The Polish government recognized the brothers with awards for their contribution to preserving history. The German War Graves Commission sent letters of thanks. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came in the form of a private message from Schneider's granddaughter. She wrote to thank them for finding her grandfather, for treating his remains with respect, and for persevering through the bureaucracy and research required to identify him. She enclosed a copy of one of his letters to her grandmother, translated into English, and asked if they would keep it as a reminder of why their work mattered. The forest where the tank was found looks much as it did before the discovery. The excavation site was carefully backfilled and allowed to return to its natural state, marked only by a small memorial plaque explaining what was found there and who died there. The trees continue their slow growth, the leaves fall and accumulate each autumn, and hikers occasionally pass through, most unaware of the drama that unfolded beneath their feet. But for those who know the story, the forest is different now. It is no longer just a pleasant woodland, but a place where history reached up from the soil to demand recognition, where the forgotten were remembered, and where 5 young men who died far from home finally received the acknowledgement and respect they deserved. The rust-orange hatch that started everything sits in a climate-controlled museum case, preserved for future generations, a tangible connection to that moment when Thomas's metal detector began its insistent beeping and set in motion a chain of events that would bridge 7 decades. If this story moved you the way it moved us, then you absolutely need to be part of this community. Smash that subscribe button right now. Seriously, stop and click it, because we bring you these incredible, deeply researched historical mysteries every single week. And if you want to go beyond just watching, if you want to directly support our work and help us uncover even more forgotten stories, click the Super Thanks button below and choose any amount that works for you. Every contribution, no matter how small, makes a massive difference in allowing us to dedicate the time and resources these stories deserve. You are literally helping us preserve and share history. And we're building an amazing global community here. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Are you in Poland near where this happened? Germany where the crew was from? Somewhere completely different? We want to know. Your engagement makes this channel what it is, and we read every single comment. So subscribe, hit that super thanks if you can, and let us know where you're joining us from. Thank you for being part of this journey into history. The story of the 5 tank crew members has been told and retold in newspaper articles, in a documentary film produced by a Polish television station, and in countless conversations among history enthusiasts. Each telling emphasizes different aspects: the detective work required to identify the remains, the technological advances that made the excavation possible, the genealogical research that connected the past to the present, or the simple human drama of families finally learning the truth. But perhaps the most important lesson from the discovery was simpler and more fundamental. The past is not truly past. It exists beneath the surface, in forests and fields, in archives and attics, waiting for someone curious enough, persistent enough, and careful enough to uncover it. Thomas and Martin Kowalski did not set out to solve a 70-year-old mystery. They set out for a morning of metal detecting, hoping to find interesting artifacts and enjoy a beautiful autumn day. What they found instead was history itself, insistent and demanding, refusing to remain buried, demanding to be known and remembered and honored. The rusted hatch, the scattered debris, the identification discs, the bones, the letters, the photograph of Margarethe and her child. All of these elements came together to transform an anonymous death in an anonymous forest into named individuals with stories, with families, with lives that mattered. That transformation, from unknown to known, from forgotten to remembered, represents perhaps the most important work historians do, whether they are professionals with advanced degrees or brothers with metal detectors and a passion for uncovering the past. In the end, the mystery was solved not by a single dramatic revelation, but by the accumulation of small details, careful documentation, persistent research, and the dedication of dozens of people who believed that these 5 men deserved to be identified and remembered. The tank hatch was just the beginning, the first signal that something important lay hidden beneath decades of accumulation. Everything that followed, the excavation, the identification, the reburial, the exhibition, the continuing research, represented a collective decision that their deaths mattered, that their stories deserved to be told, and that the past, no matter how painful or how distant, deserves our attention and our respect. The brothers still search the forests of Eastern Europe, their metal detectors sweeping back and forth across the ground, listening for signals that indicate something lies beneath. They have found many things since that October morning. More artifacts, more stories, more connections between past and present. But nothing has matched the significance of that first insistent beeping, that moment when the detector screamed about something substantial hidden in the soil, that discovery of a rust-orange hatch that would eventually lead to 5 men coming home.